Welcome everyone to Love and Liberation, Encountering the Other in the Poetry and Theology of Rav Menachem Froman with Rabbi Levi Morrow. So a little introduction to this class. Truly encountering someone outside ourselves creates a moment of both risk and possibility. In this class, we will explore the ways Rav Menachem Froman describes this encounter in both his poetry and his theology. In doing so, we will delve into the very nature of what it means to be a person and how encountering the other can help us attain liberation for all. So we have a number of offerings that are kind of tied into National Poetry Month at Drisha. This is one of them. Last night, we started another class with Daniel Kraft that you're welcome to join as well if you find this interesting. And hopefully next week, if there's enough interest, Rabbi Morrow, Rabbi Silber, and myself will begin co-teaching a joint workshop looking into the boundaries between prayer and poetry. So if you haven't met Rabbi Morrow before, Levi Morrow is a PhD candidate in modern Jewish thought at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem with a focus on political theology. He received smicha from the Shechavar Sephardic Center in Jerusalem. Levi wrote his MA in Jewish philosophy on the post-Kukian theology of Rav Shagar at Tel Aviv University and translated a volume of Derashot from Rav Shagar that is forthcoming from Magid Books, as well as extensive selections from other religious Zionist thinkers and writers, including a small, I guess you'd still call it a book by Rav Froman, who this class is about, called Making Hasidim Laugh. So that's one of the ways that I first learned about Levi. He is a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute, North America, and at the Franz Rosenzweig Minerva Research Center at Hebrew University. Levi teaches medieval and modern Jewish thought at Yeshivat Oraita in Jerusalem, where he and his wife live with their 3 children. If you have learned with Levi before, you might have noticed that number has gone up since he last taught for us. So Mazel Tov again, and I'd like to thank the baby for giving you pardon to come teach for us for a while. So without further ado, please, Levi.
Thank you, Noah, for the lovely introduction. And thank you and Drisha more generally. I've been wanting to teach this class basically since I first started learning Rav Froman years ago. I started with the little book you mentioned that I translated along with a friend of mine, Rabbi Ben Greenfield. It was his idea we translate this little book. Didn't grab my copy off the shelf, but we'll see one in a slideshow in a couple of minutes. But we're going to start what this whole class is basically going to be based off of is the first piece or the third piece in this small little book. And we'll see it in a minute. And that's going to contain, bound up within it, everything we're going to want to talk about. And then we'll flesh that out over the rest of the class. But that was one of the first pieces I encountered from him. And I've been waiting to teach this class since then. So thank you very much. Yeah, that's me. Let's jump into a slideshow. And then that will begin with me introducing Rav Menachem Froman, because he was relatively well known in his lifetime. He died in 2013, but I think probably for general introduction purposes, it's a good idea if we hit the broad point of his life. So this is our cover. See, this is Rav Menachem Froman's face. You can see on the side. 1 second. Okay. And this is a lovely piece of art. One of the few pictures of a rabbi I have, if you can call it that, on my wall. This is from Rabbi Zach Kamenetz, who is at Zach Kamenetz on Twitter and Instagram, has a huge variety of pictures of both rabbinic figures and other cultural figures, where he's done some really incredible artwork. So this is I just love this picture. This is Rav Froman, where his tefillin also wrapped around his hand over here. So Rav Froman was born in 1945, died in 2013. Was in Israel for almost the majority of his life, as far as I'm aware. He was born in a secular context. I believe he was on Kfar Hasidim up in the Galil. I'm not 100% sure about that. He actually became religious while studying in university. Not always the most common track, though it's not unheard of. From there, he went and studied Merkaz Harav Yeshiva, and became very close to Tzvi Yehuda Kook. He even lived in Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook's house at the time and served as his shamash, his sort of personal attendant. That makes it sort of very unsurprising. The next bit of his, biography, which he helped found the Gush Emunim movement. Gush Emunim is sort of the precursor of what's today called the settler movement, or just, generally the settlements. Started in 1974 after the Yom Kippur War. Gush Emunim, the block of the faithful, people who are really sort of religiously dedicated to the idea of settling the land of Israel, and that is going to be sort of where this class goes towards the end of it, seeing how we're doing time-wise. We're going to move from the personal encounter between two people towards the way that plays out in a broader Israeli and religious Zionist context. Froman also served as rabbi of the Knesset at one point in time. He taught in many different religious Zionist yeshivot. I should say, I met Rav Froman once in my life, since I helped translate a whole collection of his works. People have asked if I met him, or I met him once when I was first in Israel post high school at the age of 18 or so. I spoke not a single word of Hebrew, and I had to be explained, had to have someone explain to me what the man in the long beard had said, which turned out to be, "Are you old enough for us to count you for a minyan for mincha?" Which was a fun thing to have heard when you're 18 and just out of high school. But yeah, it was a very interesting figure. He was deeply involved in interfaith events. I don't think I have a picture of this in our slideshow tonight, but it's pretty easy to find pictures of him alongside the Dalai Lama. And he was also involved in grassroots peace activism with various Muslim Palestinian residents of the larger land of Israel, and the West Bank. And many of his students are still today involved in those sort of activist programs. There's a organization called Roots, or Shorashim, which is at least some people involved are his students. He also, in critical part of his, wrote poetry and plays, incredibly creative figure. And part of what we're going to sort of be getting at tonight is going to be about the role of emotion and sort of more the effective elements of our lives that we tend to associate with creativity, and the way he gave those sort of pride of place. And so that really comes through in his poetry, which there are 2 books that have been published, and we'll see those in a minute, but also in some of his plays he wrote, and he was broadly involved in creative life. He would regularly hold sort of evenings of learning, or Torah v'shira, or Torah shira, like evenings of Torah and song and music, sort of woven together. So that's sort of broadly Rav Froman, Rav Menachem, as he was known to his students. Most of his stuff that was published, all of it was published posthumously. This book, Sachaki Aretz, which focuses on issues relating to Israeli society and Israeli-Palestinian conflict, was published in 2013, a little bit after he passed away. So it was, I believe, already in the works before he passed away. And that's collections about the land of Israel and politics. This one is probably his best known work. It's small, pocket-sized, has roughly 180 short teachings, which span anywhere from like 3 sentences to a couple of pages, but this is a small book, so it's no more than a couple hundred words. Adam Hu Chayat is the most recently published book, which is another just like a second volume of little snippets like Chasim Tzofkim Mizeh. And then in 2017, Attain Zman was published by Magid Books, which is collections of teachings and stories he wrote. He wrote these incredible short stories in here, as well as sort of more classical teachings for the holidays of the Jewish calendar, as well as the holidays of the Israeli calendar. So in addition to Sukkot and Purim and Shavuot, you will also find Yom HaZikaron and the commemoration of the anniversary of Rabin's assassination, and May Day. You find all kinds of really interesting stuff in there. He also published, these are 3 different books. The one on the left and one on the right are poetry. Adam Min Haaretz was published in, I want to say the late 90s. Most of the poetry was written there when he went to the northern Galil and spent some time traveling around there and wrote poetry about the land, his sort of connection to the land there. And the artwork on the cover and throughout the book is done by his wife. Rabbi Hadassah Froman, still actively engaged in all the aforementioned cultural and political activities. She's actually been a big figure in for people who are following the contemporary, let's say, brouhaha here in Israel and Israeli politics. She's heavily involved in a lot of the religious side of that. This one on the right, Din v'cheshbon al hashigaon, accounting for madness in English. Again, this is her art on the cover. This is a much larger collection of poetry. Adam min Haaretz is a small one. Some of the pieces we'll see tonight are actually republished from Adam min Haaretz in Din v'cheshbon al hashigaon. Yeah, those are his 2 books of poetry. This book in the middle, Kof Acharei Elohim, sort of literally monkeying after God, means to imitate God. And to Kof Acharei is to monkey after, to ape someone, let's say. So there's aping God. This is a picture from Rav Froman's famous Hoshana Rabbah Minyan. On the last day of Sukkot, they would go do a minyan at the Kotel. It was incredibly enthusiastic, to say the least. It's actually still ongoing, but Froman is fortunately not there anymore. This book collects a couple of short essays or interviews or panels at the beginning, all of which deal with the topic of theater and plays. And then the rest of the book is actually plays that he wrote, like not screenplays, but scripts for plays. So just, yeah, that's his corpus of writings more broadly. The translation of Chasidim Tzochakim that can be found on Facebook. I believe it's just called Making Hasidim Laugh. Hopefully we published at some point, but that is out of my hands. That's been sent off to the people who own the copyrights, and they will do what they will with that. So with that, perhaps too lengthy introduction. Freedom and the self. We're going to talk about in this section 2 short pieces from Chasidim Tzochakim, and anyone who wants can see the source sheet that Drisha has and has sent out people who signed up, which has slightly more extensive versions of these 2 teachings, because I've only put in the PowerPoint the pieces we need. We're going to see here is what does it mean to be free, and what does it mean to be a person, to have a self, and how does that necessarily put us in relationship with other people, such as being in a relationship with someone else is really critical for that. And we're going to see that in the very first piece here, which I mentioned before, is one of the first things I learned from him, and I've been just excited about it ever since. And then we'll sort of flesh out the model of the self and relationship that this implies, and then see how that works out in poetry and prayer and politics. So this is the 3rd teaching in Chasidim Tzochakim Mizeh. He says, generally speaking, people understand marriage as a kind of prison. When you're single, you're free, you can do whatever you wish. Marriage means taking responsibility for life. It's a kind of obligation that restricts my freedom. And we're all familiar with this from sort of any depiction of marriage in the media, just about. Marriage is just, you're getting locked down, as it were. However, you can see this too in the exact opposite light. Or someone say you would look at marriage or commitment as actually enabling freedom. And I should note that marriage is just like a huge theme throughout his teachings and writings. We don't need as a whole other class, but that's sort of why he's talking about that here. He determines, the exact opposite way. Yes, the single person has control of his life. He decides. He determines what he'll do today and what he'll do tomorrow. When you marry, you lose control. Any minute, my wife might call and tell me to do something. I don't have control over my life. When I lose control, I am swept into the river of the divine overflow that is this world. And then I'm truly free. And divine overflow is Hashefa Ha'elohi. Another sort of feature of his writings is Hasidic and Kabbalistic terminology. It appears here the divine overflow that sort of emanates from God, that sustains the world, is that you can sort of let go and be washed into it. And that is true freedom. I give up on the I that decides and chooses, and in its place, I flow, and live. Everyone thinks that being free means being me. But in my life experience, the primary chains holding me back are my internal chains, my self-definitions. When I liberate myself from myself, that's when I'm truly free. Which is why it was the way of our teacher, Rabbi Nachman, to never insist on anything. That's a quotation. I don't take a stand on my preferences, I just flow. Right, so this a couple of lines are really important for thinking out what he means here, what he wants getting at, why he thinks this is a compelling model of freedom. Right, he says, my primary chains holding me back are my internal chains, my self-definitions, that true freedom is to liberate yourself from yourself. Or that we have certain ways we think of ourselves and certain ways we want to be. And on one hand, that might be great. But if there's more to us than, as he puts it here, the I that decides and chooses, then the question is, how does that other part of ourselves also become free? Right? If who we are is, for lack of a better term, rational consumers, right? People who can choose what they want and acquire it and go after it, then great. That's what it means to be free, is to have the ability to choose to get what you want. But if who we are is something much more complex, that is not just about rationality and choice, and it is also about emotions, and as we'll see in a second, even about things that are sort of opaque to us, that we don't always or in fact, you might say are frequently incapable of fully understanding ourselves. And the question is, how do we achieve freedom for a whole self that we ourselves can't fully, access in order to make decisions for, right? How do we unleash the part of ourself that exceeds our own sort of awareness of it? And if this is starting to sound a little bit Freudian to anyone, that is not an accident. This is piece 166 from Chassidim Tzochakim Mizeh. He said, Freud and the Zohar say essentially the same thing. In this piece too, there is from a somewhat longer piece, the full piece of which is the full extent of which is in the source sheet. But this ellipses in the middle is not because I cut something out. This is actually sort of straight through. The Chassidim Tzochakim Mizeh texts are transcriptions from his classes on the Zohar. So this is either where the editor decided to cut something out or where he just sort of trailed off in the middle of a sentence in the transcription. So he said, Freud and the Zohar say essentially the same thing. They share a fundamental sense that the foundation of everything is hidden, unrevealed, concealed, right? And so the thing that Freud is sort of best known for in popular culture is the idea of the unconscious, that we have sort of unconscious desires or drives. Froman was not the kind of person who we should try and go, what version of Freud he's working with here. He's working the idea that there's who we are is built on a concealed basis, right? One other text in Chassidim Tzochakim Mizeh, he says, we make the bracha in the morning brachot every morning, Rokaha Aretz Al Hamayim, that God sort of firms the water and the land upon the water. That the meaning behind that bracha is we give thanks that God allows us to forget the unstable elements of ourself and pretend that we exist in a solid way. But he says here, the primary aspect of a person, the primary aspect, what motivates them is his unconscious. The primary aspect of the world is the concealed light. And this is, again, Kabbalistic terminology. As opposed to the revealed light originating in the sun and created on the fourth day, this is the light of the first day, which was concealed, like the foundations of a building covered with soil, like silver hidden beneath floor tiles. A person's task is to uncover these foundations and interact with them. For Freud, this happens on the psychologist's couch. For the Zohar, this happens when a righteous person gets up at midnight when there's no sun, and they lay concealed light bare into the darkness by studying the hidden Torah. And he says that the learning Torah at night is a strong Kabbalistic motif, and particularly in the Zohar. And in fact, most of the classes from which Chassidim Tzochakim Mizeh was taken was Zohar classes. But the idea, he elsewhere in this piece connects it again to the idea of marriage, the idea of dedication to something outside yourself, right? The getting up in the middle of the night, sort of forcing yourself to get up and engage with this, even when you're not sort of fully conscious. In fact, maybe especially when you're not sort of in the most aware state of mind, is a moment when you can interact with the aspects of yourself that are not fully rational, not fully intentional. That you can, get in touch with your emotions more, get in touch with your unconscious. And that's what is set free in the encounter with the other, right? So just to return to that idea that when you're married to someone, when you're deeply committed to someone, when you have someone who comes from this outside yourself, right? There's someone other than you, they can make a demand of you, right? They demand at the very least sort of basic respect in human dignity. They might make demands on your time, right? So in the previous piece, He says, any minute my wife might call and tell me to do something, right? And that you are bound to respond to someone. I always say that, like, the best example of this is not even a relationship with another, adult. It's when you have a child who you really do owe things to, and who often is fully incapable of explaining themselves to you and why they're not listening or why they're demanding something. That caring for a child is perhaps the greatest experience of loving something other than yourself, purely because it can often be totally alienating and inexplicable to yourself, and make demands of you that enable you to or that force you to get outside your own thought of the way things should be, that you get to get outside the sense that you're in charge of your life anymore, and you get to make full decision, have full carte blanche over the way things should work. And he says, in that moment, when you recognize you don't have full carte blanche, that you also realize that over yourself, that you, in responding to this person, are freer in a fuller sense than if you're just making conscious decisions. So those are kind of dense ideas. That's the basic conceptual understanding that's going to set the stage for looking at a couple of Froman's poems and then some more teachings. Does anyone have any? I'm stopping with any questions so far. Just see how we're doing.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Oh, hey, this is fascinating. So, and I thank you for explaining it so clearly and giving us such rich sources. I've come with knowing nothing at all about this particular poet and amazing human being. I'm just a little bit confused about the hidden light. There's a difference between hidden and concealed. And is the relationship between, are there two relationships going on here? Number one, with the light itself once revealed, and then the relationship with that property that's concealing it, whatever that is, within a person's psyche, wherever the Zohar or the Torah, the hidden Torah locates it. Are there two relationships going on there? And is there any difference between hidden and concealed? So thank you. Whatever part of that you want to address is
That's
to us anyway. So.
It's a fascinating question. There's a couple things. One, he didn't write this down as like a systematic treatise or even as a poem. This part, we're going to see some of his poems. I think in the poems we should feel freer to be a little more specific about the language he uses. This is much more like it was a flow of language. So I'm not inclined to distinguish between hidden and concealed, particularly because, again, this is even translation. The question about the two relations to that which is hidden and that which is doing the hiding, if I've understood you correctly, is a fascinating one. My sense is that he would say that which is doing the hiding is just the natural tendency of our conscious minds, that we have a tendency to sort of suppress those parts of ourselves that are less transparent to ourselves and not always the most in line with how we think of ourselves. And he has another short piece in Chasim Tzolchakim Mizeh where he's talking about faith and ideology in general, and he critiques. He says that religious Zionism, and this is when he was writing it. Actually, not even sure when that piece was from, but well before the current era, say probably in the mid-90s. He's saying their religious Zionist community is too confident in itself, and that closes it off from God, from truth, from the world. That if you're super confident in your own ideology and your own path and in what you think you know, then that closes you off to learning new ideas and encountering God and stuff like that. So I think the hiding and suppressive tendency is innate for him, and he wants us to get past that to whatever could be beyond it. Oh,
great. Thanks, Rabbi.
No problem. think I saw something in the chat. Freedom, so the question is, the experience of freedom is what freedom is here, not the break from the causal chain. It is actually a recognition of what is within us and causing us to do things, and that is a sensation of freedom. Right, so just briefly in a sort of broader philosophical context, we often talk about freedom as the ability to make a choice based on nothing. I make a choice freely, I just decide this is what I'm going to do. But there is a different model of freedom that has representatives in the Jewish tradition and non-Jewish tradition. Fazda Kreskas is the medieval philosopher most involved in this. He's quite likely the source for the Jewish/secular philosopher Benedict Spinoza, who also believes some of this, that freedom is not about I just choose. It's about the ability to act out myself, to work based off of who I am inside, as opposed to because something outside of me is forcing me. And so Froman's working much more based on this. How do I sort of let loose this internal aspect of myself? How do I free that from not just external constraints, meaning things outside me, but even the part of myself that is, as it were, more external? That you might think you have this, you have this inner core that is unconscious, that is less transparent, and then your rational mind is somewhat more external and sort of keeps that part tamped down. So the question is not how do I make a choice free from any external constraints, but how do I, get rid of what he called my internal constraints? How do I tamp that down and let what is inside me flow freely? And that image of flowing from the first piece we saw is, I think, pretty important. So with that said, let's go back to the PowerPoint. This is a picture of him davening. We're going to talk a little bit about tefillah. We're going to look at two poems. Right, so this is a poem called Hakdama Gam L'Tefillah, translated roughly as an introduction for prayer as well. We'll see why as well in just a second. He quotes or paraphrases a Gemara from Shabbat. And for this part, I'm just going to read the English. Once a non-Jew came before Hillel and asked to be taught the entire Torah on one foot. He told him the general principle, love your fellow as yourself, right? So the non-Jew comes to Hillel and says, teach me the Torah on 1 foot. And he says, I'm going to give you a 1 foot answer for what is Torah as a whole. It's love your fellow as yourself. That somehow all of Torah can be summed up as loving your fellow, or perhaps that because the way sort of the story goes, it ends with the Hillel saying, well, then go and learn, like and continue. So this may just be that like the introduction to Torah is love your fellow as yourself, or and he's saying Haftama Gam L'Tefillah. This is an introduction not just to Torah, but also to Tefillah. The phrase love your fellow as yourself is a introduction to Tefillah, or perhaps even a summing up of what it is to daven, to pray. People who are interested can go look up the original source. It's a little bit different, but not significantly. He's just sort of paraphrasing it. I want to read now his poem in the Hebrew in my English translation. My English translation is not perfect. That's the nature of translating poetry, is that you always have to sacrifice something because there's too much happening that is simply impossible to capture in a different language. So I'm going to read the Hebrew and take what you like about my English, and if you have other corrections, I probably agree with them. Okay, so ha'acher hu hagehinom sheli. Ze hadavar hayachid sheli hu pashut ubarur kol kach she'en li ma lefaresh o lehosif alav davar. She'ha'acher hu gam hamiklat hayachid min hagehinom sheli. The other is my hell. This is the only thing that to me is simple and so clear that I don't need to explain or add to it, that the other is also my only refuge from this hell of mine. And he's working here off Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, who wrote in one of his plays that the hell is other people. So the other is my hell seems to be a sort of clear reference to that. And notably, he references Jean-Paul Sartre in the elsewhere in Chasidim Tzochakim Mizeh. There's another Kabbalistic symbol or term is the Sitra Achra, the mystical other side. And he says he likes to refer to Jean-Paul Sartre as Jean-Paul Sartre Achra. So he's clearly from where it starts, and here he's working off. Sorry, he says the other is my hell. Right. The Sartre's idea was the other sort of imposes upon me from the outside their assumptions about who I am, their understanding of me, what they think about me, and I get sort of frozen. That instead of being this free being capable of deciding who I am and what I want to be, I feel stuck in their perception of me, right? So that's where you start. The other is my hell, but he ends up at the other is also my only refuge from this hell of mine, from the way that I myself am paralyzing to myself, that I get stuck in myself, and only in encountering something outside myself can I be free from that. And two things happen here. He's both attempting to characterize what it means to encounter someone outside ourselves and what it means to pray. So for him, this moment of prayer is both an encounter with, this moment of prayer is an encounter with something outside myself, and it has to be understood through this understanding of encountering another person, right? So as we've said in the previous section, to encounter another person is to have a moment where something forces you to respond to it. Something makes a demand of you, even as simple as respond to me, as work not on your own timetable. Something that pulls you outside of your own sense of the way things should work and how things should be working and how you want them to work. And so that is what it means to encounter someone else, and therefore for Froman, also part of what it means to pray. That to pray means to take a moment to set aside your own sensibilities about the way things should work. That it means to sort of make the unconscious or less transparent parts of yourselves, to surface them, to try and let them be present in a moment where you are getting outside of your own priorities. And he says that's why he says it's a moment where I have nothing to explain or add to it. That it's not about my own sort of intellectual interpretation. It's not about my contribution. It's about the sort of moment of to repeat myself a little bit too much, it's about responding to something outside myself in a way that sets aside the surface layer of rational choosing and allows the deeper parts of yourself to emerge. And that's, again, it means to encounter someone else in life in general, and then also, like, that is what it means to love your fellow as yourself. We'll see in a second, there's that idea of your fellow as yourself, that the mirroring there is not incidental, and you bring that also into tefillah. Because this is a poem, I'll take actually questions now if there are any before moving on to the next one. Anyone have anything they'd like to clarify or ask about? Okay, that's all for now. We'll move on to the next one, another poem, also from Accounting for Madness. This one is called, I called it a matched pair. The Hebrew title is Zo Leumat Zo. And this is for anyone who's familiar with it, is also Kabbalistic terminology about the way sort of God has created the world with a mirrored positive and negative forces in it. It's less important for this. I'm not even sure it's an intentional reference, but it's very likely because it is in his general repertoire. Right, so this is Zo Leumat Zo. At encha mevina kama ani boded. At encha ro'a et kol harik hashkarim v'ha'afsuyot at ohevet oti. Ani mevin oti, ani levadi, ani ro'eh, lechen ani lo. You don't understand how alone I am. You don't see it all, the emptiness, the lies, and the nothingnesses. You love me. I understand me. I alone, I see, and therefore I do not. And there's a definite sense here, as we're saying, there's a very sort of pessimistic streak here, and that's sort of pessimism, or what do you say, like a darkness is too strong a word, but it is something of a dark streak. Accounting for Madness has a decently large section of poems that are in one way or another about death, that are some of the most striking poems in it that are phenomenal, but there's definitely a certain darkness there. And I think also there's a certain realism involved in that. And I tend to say that realists are it's what pessimists call themselves. So maybe this is just still pessimistic, but when he's talking about this sort of unconscious aspect of yourself, there's a way you could do that where you say like, oh, the best parts of ourselves are all really unconscious and we should just let that out. And he's doing that a little bit, but he's also aware that like what it means to say that we're not just purely rational choosers, and that we say that our emotions are a really important part of it. Like our emotions aren't always great. Depression is a real thing, sadness is a real thing, anger is a real thing, senses of emptiness is a real thing. Recognizing that your own self-perception is not necessarily accurate. This creates this sense of, he says, shkarim, of the lies within you. Like those aren't great, all positive things. And they are things that you have to confront once you start working with a sense of the model of the self. And he says, I can kind of get stuck in that, right? When that is how you think of yourself, you can feel kind of stuck, right? As he ends here, I understand myself and therefore I cannot love myself. That to love someone and to be loved by someone is to be able to cross that bridge between two people and sort of pull them out of all the things they know about themselves. That because we're dealing with a model of the self as opaque and as you can't be fully aware, then even everything he's saying about himself here, you have to take as partial. That you can't fully understand yourself, even when you're saying you don't fully understand yourself. That you need someone outside you to help you sort of get outside even your own sense of, I'm this person who's full of unconscious emotions and who just needs to break free of rational restraints or something like that. Like that itself is a self-perception. It's the internal restraints he was talking about before. And that encountering another person, a moment of love, is a moment where you love someone, recognizing you don't know them entirely, and you attempt to engage with them and be in a relationship with them. And that is something quite redemptive for them, because they, can't love themselves fully. They can't know themselves fully. And they know they can't know themselves fully, whereas you from the outside don't see all of that. You aren't part of their internal monologue. You just know what you know them from the outside, and you're capable of encountering them and engaging with them and loving with them as you experience them without having to worry about sort of all of that, right? And that's why in the previous poem, we said, the other is also my only refuge. That because he has the sense of the sort of internal turmoil that exists, the person who can also help you for at least a time escape this internal turmoil, or that you can sort of flow with them as opposed to being stuck in your own internal dynamics, is something quite almost redemptive about that. This is the end of the prayer in the other section. So does anyone have thoughts, questions on this? Anyone want to expand upon?
I was thinking, especially after the second poem, about the kind of gross theological implications that could stem from this. We talk about loving God, and I know one thing that really made me attached to Drisha was listening to Rabbi Silber teach, and his willingness to criticize certain, forefathers in the Torah who folks in other communities, like, they always try to like come up with apologetics, like, oh, well, it really wasn't bad that Abraham, pushed, Sarah into such and such situation because XYZ, and here's a midrash that justifies it. And I think that as humans, like, we maybe have to have a certain amount of that in order to love God, because we live in this world, and we are aware of what's happening in the world and what has happened in the world. And if there's a God at the foundation of all of it, one might have questions, but not knowing is helpful in loving God sometimes, I think. But that's just it. Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think like you end up on very speculative theological grounds, to say the least. But I think once we say that the model of loving another person involves these sort of questions about how much you can know about them and how much they can know about themselves, then like when we use that as a metaphor for talking about God, it's strange to leave out that part, right? That like, oh, we say love is complicated, but when we love God, it's simple. Like that would be strange. But so yeah, it's a very good point. Anyone else?
I would just question one word in the translation. In the last line, lachen ani lo, I would translate that therefore I am not, as opposed to do not. In other words, the moment you think you understand yourself, ani mevinuti, ani levadi, ani roeh, then you're not. This whole concept of following that in the end there's the hiddenness, and the moment that you're connected to the acher, you kind of lose a little bit of that sense of connectedness to God or connectedness to the inner hiddenness. Just a minor emendation on the translation.
Yeah, I think you're right about the importance of that idea. I chose to go with I do not to parallel the you love me in the first part because it is paralleling back and forth, and it's called Zulu and Zo. But I think that's important that that's there, right? That he could have said Lachen ani lo ohevo, or whatever. He could have put the verb in there instead of just leaving it as ani lo. So I think that's important. I think I saw a hand raised.
If nobody
No?
else had anything, I was going to say, I liked the parallel, the at ohevdoti ani mevinoti, right? And so you love me, but I understand me. But then, as soon as I say I understand me, immediately I'm alone, right? And I see, but what do I see? If I'm alone, I'm looking out into like nothingness, and so now all of a sudden I am nothing because I liked your ani lo. That's I also saw that. I agree. Sorry. But and that I think definitely like connects back to the previous one about the acher, that you need somebody else to be the miklat for yourself, because otherwise all of a sudden you're all alone in this huge infinite emptiness, and it's hard to like remain somebody when you're all alone. No man is an island, whatever.
Yeah, 100%. I want to, everyone's seeing the clock now. We've got 15 minutes left. I don't want to stay late, so I'm going to jump back into the PowerPoint. Second. Sorry, 1 second, and then we'll do the final section of this. Okay. The last section we're going to talk about, and we're not going to do all the pieces in here because there are too many and we don't have time. But this is Rav Froman and Sheikh Ibrahim, who he was closer friends with. He's known for his friendship with various Israeli Arab and Palestinian Arab figures. There can sometimes be controversy about what it means that he had these friendships or ongoing relationships with them. So one of the people he was in dialogue with was Yasser Arafat, another person whose name I've forgotten, but I translated an essay by a student of Rav Froman named Rav Shlomo Spivak that can be found on the Layer House website about Rav Froman, where he talks there about one of his relationships with some Arab leader, and the editor wanted it to be marked down that he was friends with this person, and Rav Spivak insisted no, he was not friends. In fact, he celebrated when the person died. So what that means is complicated. But he also, in another piece in Chasidim Tzochakim Mizeh, talks about how he used to go learn more nevuchim with the defense minister of Hamas in Gaza, and how he procured an Arabic copy for that man, and lamented that Israel's defense ministers don't learn more nevuchim. So he was. This goes down to his grassroots peace activism, and we're going to see this comes down to the same model of the self and the way it structures our relationships with other people. Which are the subtitle for this actually in praise of primitivity. Primitive being a word we tend to associate with people from civilization looking at people without civilization. Right? That's where the word sort of emerges from. For Rav Froman, it's going to become a word of praise, right? And so we're going to get to the point where he's using that as that's something we should actively seek out, is the primitive within ourselves and the way that can help us engage with the primitive in other people. In some part, he's reappropriating that from people who would still use it negatively. He's going to say that like he identifies as part of religious Zionism, the religious Zionist community, which nowadays is much more part of the Israeli mainstream, but for a lot of his life really was not considered like primitive people by a mainstream secular part of Israeli society. And so we're not going to see all the pieces here, but he wants to say that like there's something very special that primitive people have to contribute in general, and then specifically in terms of peace. And yeah, we will get there. But before we do that, we'll look at first a short poem and then one or two theological pieces on the way that sort of quest for primitivity should actually structure our relationship with the land. And so this is another poem from Accounting for Madness that was first published in Man from the Land, Adam Min Haaretz, and the version in Adam Min Haaretz has a little line that is added that says this is based on the beginning of Masechet Kiddushin, right? On the beginning of the tractate of Kiddushin. Does not clarify if it means Gemara or Mishnah, but you'll see the relevance. I think if not, we'll explain it. He says, Shirat Adama, the song of the soil. Im be'emet oti tohav. Madua bidvekut kazot ata ochez bishtar hakesef hame'aver einecha v'nistera mimach haderech lavo elai. If it is really me that you love, why are you so attached to the financial contract that blinds your eyes and conceals from you the road that leads to me? Right? Short, sweet. The song of the soil, the song sung by the land of Israel, and not the land as in the geography and the territory, but the land as in the very material dirt, the substance of the land itself, sings and says to Froman, to the religious Zionists, if it is me that you love, why are you so worried about the contract or the deed, right? Just find me. The fact is some sense of worrying about the deed, worrying about ownership in a legal sense, and ownership in a like contractual sense, actually takes you away from direct contact, right? And this gets back to the same themes of sort of true self versus internal constraints and technical rational thinking. So here played out on the not yet quite political scale, that's sort of implied, but on the question of your relationship with the land of Israel. Is it based on contract or based on sort of contact, intimate contact with the land? And the reference seems to be, in terms of Kiddushin, to just the very beginning of the first Mishnah in Kiddushin, which says there are three ways in which a marriage is enacted: kesef, shtar, and bia. Right, so kesef, money; shtar, contract, rendered in the perhaps overly technical financial contract, and bia, which means sexual intercourse, direct physical contact, which seems to be the implication here at the end. Haderech lavo elai, the way that leads to me, and vo and bia being the same words in Hebrew. In the sense of like, you should be seeking intimacy with the land, not seeking ownership over the land. That's seems to be the sense we're going for here. And I want to look quickly at the next piece before we tag any question. We might wait for questions till the end at this point. This is again Chassidim Tochakim Mizeh. He's settling the land can be an expression of love for the soil and commitment to it, but it can also be a crushing, aggressive act of conquest. And I should just note, conquest here, I don't remember if I translate this or Ben, but conquest here in the Hebrew is kibush, which is the contemporary word for occupation. So as Zionists, we sang, "We'll dress you in the gown of concrete and cement." Are the asphalt roads and concrete buildings how a lover clothes his beloved in a beautiful garment, or are they a prison outfit for the soil? I remember one of the first marches that Gush Emanim organized for the Shomron after the Six-Day War. They presented a display with a vision for the future of the Shomron, highways full of cars because of how many settlers there are. I stood there with my friend, Professor Yehuda Leibus, who was a big Zohar scholar, and he said to me, "Have we gone mad? Is this what we want, to replace a narrow, beautiful road between these hills with a fast road that will block the view?" It's not always easy to distinguish between loving the land and strangling it. Right? So the question is going to be like, is our love of the land going to lead to us basically totally divorcing ourselves from the land, living in complex cities and having massive highways? And there's a degree to which this is, to use the word we're going to see, him primitivist, right? That he's actually almost sort of anti-urban here, and that is, to me at least, somewhat sort of foreign. I like living in a city. I have a less romantic sense about the countryside, but in the sense of, are we here trying to live in the land versus trying to impose ourselves and our civilization on the land? And which side of that do we fall on is one I think is very powerful. We're going to skip this next piece. Actually, I'm going to summarize this quickly outside because it's a phenomenal drasha. He refers back to the story of the spies, where the spies refer to the land and devouring its inhabitants. And he says, yes, that's actually the point. He says that when you come to the land of Israel, you should worry less about the land, about your environment affecting you, that outside the land of Israel, Jews have to work hard not to be affected by their environment. And when you come to the land, you can just chill out and let the land sort of swallow you up a little bit. And this, again, I'll summarize outside. This is a piece from Tain Lizman on the holidays, put out in Magid, from a drasha for Pesach. And he talks about the Maharal's idea that what makes matzah lechem oni a bed of impoverishment is that it is simple and unsophisticated and uncomplex, and that there's a simplicity to it that has removed all of the external technicalities and things. And that's what real freedom is for the Maharal. And Froman gets back to that as well. And he says, actually, if you look at study of comparative religion, they say that religion, one of the things it does is it preserves the primitive. Matzah is a primitive bread, sukkah is a primitive house, shofar is a primitive musical instrument. And here at the end, he says, perhaps the most essential part of Judaism is its primitive aspect, where a rich, sophisticated person connects to the basic primitive part of his personality, that the engaging with rituals that preserve something from ages gone past is a way of accessing a part of ourselves that is not the purely rational and technical. Okay, so this is more to the point, and this might be the second to last text we will look at tonight, I think. This is from Sachaki Aretz. And there's numerous places in Sachaki Aretz where he invokes questions of primitivity. And here he's going to do it in context of the idea of relating, like how Israelis and Palestinians could come together. He says, generally speaking, the left, the Israeli left, represents a modern and Western way of thinking, while the greater land of Israel, people who believe in Eretz Yisrael HaShlema in Hebrew, represents a traditional and primitive line of thought. Right, and you can see here people use primitive in a negative way, and he's going to try and transevaluate that and to make it into a good thing. So this is why leftists look down on partisans of the greater land of Israel. This is why Western countries accepted the left's peace plan. This is written in 1996. He's talking about the Oslo Accords. However, as a primitive religious Jew connected to the soil of the land which God gave to his fathers, I can testify. This is also why the connection between the greater land of Israel partisans and the Palestinians is so much potential. It's exactly the question of like primitivity that it makes it, he sees potential for a great relationship between DACA, the people who believe in the greater land of Israel, and Palestinians. They too, the Palestinians as well, are generally religious, or at least very connected to tradition, people, and soil. The only thing disrupting this connection is xenophobia. Primitive people generally express their connection to their people through hating the other people, and certainly through hating the son of the people who makes war against them, right? Normally we express identity as part of a group by hating the other group. Certainly if the children of that group are fighting against us. So it is for the Palestinians, and so it is for our Jews, right? We are, in fact, mirroring them in this way. Many of the Greater Land of Israel partisans, particularly given our current cultural climate, when they feel attacked and denigrated by the left, protect themselves with a thick layer of stubbornness and isolation. Right? So actually, we react very much the same as Palestinians. We believe in the same sort of things, we act in the same sort of way, and it's this same basic sense of who we are as part of a group with a place we live that we connect to, that actually is something we share on a fundamental level. He says that we actually have much more in common with them than with the secular leftists in Tel Aviv or in Ramallah. Like he used to say the reason Oslo didn't work is that because it was just a peace deal being made by secular people in Tel Aviv with secular people in Ramallah and ignored all of the sort of religious people in between. A little later in the book, he says someone who defines themselves as connected on a fundamental level to the soil could be called primitive. We could also claim that someone who lives in a sumud relationship to the land is not free. And sumud here is an Arabic word that emerged into Palestinian America after the 6-Day War to mean someone who takes a stand and stands steadfast and firm for their land. You say that such a person is not free, just as a tree does not move easily from place to place. If we want to find ways to make peace with such a person, we must recognize and respect his self-definition. This is why I concluded that those Israelis who live the connection of a person to the soil are so important for peace. To speak more clearly, it is exactly the settlers who could form a bridge between the Jewish people and the Palestinian people, or to use a more poetic formulation, one I've repeated over the years, the settlements could be the fingers of the Israeli hand reaching out in peace. And the word fingers bears connotations of close contact and sensitivity, right? That exactly the people who want to live in the land could be the beginning of people who want to live in the land together, as it were. I want to end with a poem. Before I say it, I'll say, like, again, Rav Froman died in 2013. Even then in his life, he was considered to be in many ways a utopian and unrealistic thinker. Certainly today's ongoing political developments, I can't say they would have changed the way he thought necessarily, but it's not easy to look at what he's saying and see the contemporary political reality and see how they might match up. But he's working off the same basic idea. I think if you think it's compelling on a interpersonal level, that trying to be present with the deeper parts of ourselves that are not purely sort of logical and rational to other people, and recognize that they have parts of themselves that aren't totally logical and rational and that aren't transparent to themselves. If you think that makes sense on an interpersonal level, then he's saying that also plays out on a political level. That both you have to make space for the sort of irrationalities of other people, and it's in fact desirable, that in fact there's a great, almost redemptive and liberatory potential in doing so. I'm going to quickly read a last poem, Hoshana Lizmanenu, Hoshana, like with the liturgical poems we say during Sukkot, the Hoshanot. He wrote this after encountering a Bedouin in the Judean desert during Chol Moed Sukkot. Ani v'hu v'eretz shlema gozeret bein nidudav bein achizato v'chol hazeh v'chom hazeh hu mutach el haslaim v'ani mutach el hashtomamut mazeh mechaber bein hametzukim hakashim v'et hashvil ha'amok sheli v'beten haraka shel havadi v'dai yesh ma kamo machazeh sherav la'avor et hamidbar hagadol v'hanora hazeh Eretz Saraf Tzima'on El Hamakom Shesham Hakavim Hamakbilim El Gidot Havadi Mitchabrim Kmo Ba'agadot Ve'edai Hem Hashemayim Hamelubanim Ve'Eretz Harotachat Sheyom Echad Ba'beten Vadi Echad Hayiti Basar Echad Im Even Ben Mitzukim Gvohim Utechelet Melubenet Mechubarim Belo Tachlit Ani Behu Hoshiana. He and I and the whole land tearing between his wanderings and his hold on the sand in this heat, he melts into the rocks and I am cast into astonishment. What is this connecting the hard cliffs and the deep path of mine through the belly of the wadi? Certainly there is something like a play, a heat wave crossing this great awesome desert and a land of burning and thirst to the place where the parallel lines of the banks of the wadi connect like in the stories, and my witnesses are the bleached skies and the boiling land that one day in one wadi's belly I was one flesh with stone, between high cliffs and bleached blue, connected without end. He and I, please save. we don't have time for me to go through all the depths of this poem, but the clear sense of having had this moment encountering this Bedouin while he was hiking, he was struck by the question of owning the land versus wandering in the land. And he was struck by the just sort of pure materiality of the land and the sky and the outcroppings and the rocks and sort of melting into them and hoping for something more. As a quick word of summary, we've seen how his understanding of the self and having almost sort of internal opacity and unconscious things means that encountering someone else is a real moment of getting out of my own way in some ways, because I'm focusing on someone else and sort of letting my own self-perceptions dominate who I am. We've seen how that is rehearsed again and reiterated again in the moment of prayer, as a moment of getting outside myself, setting myself aside. And we've seen how that shapes a certain relationship both to the land of Israel and to the people with whom we, and I speak of we as Israeli Jews living here in the land of Israel, relate to others living here. I think we're now over time, but I'm not going anywhere. So if there's questions, I'm more than happy to take them and to stop sharing. But for everyone who has to go, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And thank you again to Trisha. Yeah, Neil, do we have time for questions, or do you have to shut us down?
No, but we have time if folks have questions or comments. I'm just going to put the source sheet in the chat again if anyone wants to, take that for further indulging in the depths.
Is there any allusion in the Acher to the Acher of Elisha ben Avuya?
It's possible.
A sense of the struggle, the internal struggle of belief. And so on the one hand, Acher hu gehinom sheli, at the same time it's the miklat. In other words, I wonder if there's a certain also allusion to that.
Yeah, so yeah, the poem is almost too brief to know if he's alluding to that. But it's certainly possible, and I think it makes sense in exactly what you're talking about. Like Acher becomes this figure of I don't want to say the rabbinic unconscious, but sort of the negative image of how you want a rabbinic figure to work, and exactly the question of rabbinic self-perception. Like, oh, Elisha ben Avuya was this supposedly great figure, like he broke so easily. Like, what did he see too much? And what does that mean about understanding? Like, you don't think about heresy as having understood too much. You think of understanding as understood not enough or understood poorly or something like that. Like, it raises all kinds of questions. And so putting Elisha ben Avuya Acher as the Acher in the story, like in this poem, makes a lot of sense. I think there's a lot to that. Jennifer, your hand up.
Oh, actually, I wondered, Miriam, do you mind if I ask your question, or would you go ahead and ask her? Oh, okay. Hey, Miriam asked a great question. At the end of this last poem, where he closes with save. Wait, let me get the exact.
Hoshiana, please save.
Yeah, save, please save. Save from what?
It's a good question. And he doesn't say there. My sense is that it's from, well, the very least, the way he opens the poem, Eretz Shlema Gozeret, the land that is tearing,
Okay.
that is sort of being torn. And that may mean, I think it's sort of the most immediate sense of it in the poem, of between Israeli sovereignty and like ownership of the land versus Bedouin, not just like refusal of sovereignty, but like refusal of the idea of owning land in a fixed way. That the Bedouins, to whatever degree, still are, and certainly were nomadic. And it's an entirely different relationship to land, much more like what he was talking about in some of the other pieces of feeling at home in the land, as opposed to feeling ownership over the land. But the way, generally speaking, the way that the land of Israel has become a site of contestation and ownership that tears it into bits. And in one of the pieces we didn't look at, again, it's in the source sheet, from Tain Lizman, he talks about the idea that if we stop trying to work based on sort of rational technical ownership and things, you might envision other ways of living in the land, such that he says the solution might not be Palestinian Authority withdrawing from some space and Israeli Authority withdrawing from other space to create two states, but actually the two groups expanding and merging and talking about some sort of federation, a binational federation. You'll find his students and others talking about that today. That sort of idea that actually it's not about each of us pulling until we've pulled the whole land apart, so much as each of us relaxing and melting into the land and making space for each other while living in amongst each other, something like that.
So in other words, with Miriam's question of literally, what are we praying to be saved from? Was the act,
So I think from that contestation, from that the situation where we feel like we have to be fighting with other people over the land.
I mean, I'm a little confused because it's not necessarily the pshat of the words, right? Because the Eretz Shlema gozeret bein nidudav levein achizato b'chol hazeh, right? So it's being torn between his, I think you said wanderings, and his grip on the sand, which is not something you can grip. But I'm not sure it's between his and his. I'm not sure that we come into it.
I'm not sure who if it's meant to be both, like the same referent for both of those hymns, or his wanderings and his hold. It does go from him then back to I, but I remember I was reading this and wondering, is this supposed to be his wanderings and my holding? The sense of melting away, that he melts into the rocks and I'm cast into astonishment, but then later, because one day in the wadi's belly, I was one with flesh with stone. Like, it's not clear to me the sense of identity throughout the poem. But I'll say also, yeah, I'm not entirely certain what the specific reference of the please save us is, the please save. Like, the most immediate thing that makes sense to me is that the tearing of the land between wandering and possession, whether you say it's the one Bedouin's wandering possession, which I don't know what that would mean, or if it is through these two different methods of ownership, or like I don't have a very specific concrete answer to the question of what's that going for, except that it means something like this general problem he was dealing with.
I think it's also a play on the actual tefillah in Hoshanot, which is Ani Vaho Hoshiana, referring to God. And here the play is, it's not me and God, Ani Vaho, or like V'anvehu. It's Ani Vahu Hoshiana. It's that connection on a very basic, primitive level. It's not, which is, and it's a very interesting play on the Hoshanas, where we say Hoshiana to God. We pray for Hoshiana, and he's saying our salvation is in our relationship with the Bedouin.
Yeah, I read an interpretation of this poem years ago. I think it was by Aubrey Glazer. I'm not certain, but it was whoever wrote it argued that like this poem actually has you, and because of exactly what you're saying, the Ani Vahu as a play on Ani Vaho, meaning I and God, that the other is where I encounter God. That somehow in encountering the Bedouin was also a moment of encountering God. And that's definitely possible. I tend to be a little bit of a conservative reader in some ways, and that's not to say an objective or accurate reader. It's a specific form of interpretation. So I am lucky to say that he felt himself encountering this other person, that both of them in their moment of encounter, in their living in the land, require the sort of the divine salvation. There's this crying out for help us get out of this situation. But both interpretations are work. Yeah.
I mean, connecting is mentioned 3 times, connect. But, and it seems as if he's reading the land as the land itself is one with itself. The heat wave crosses the whole land, the burning, the thirst, and yet the lines, the way about 2/3 of the way down, were the parallel lines of the banks of Wadi, are these two stories, one the wanderer and one our poet. And that's going to be the struggle.
Right. So I think again, it goes from the land that's being torn towards these connections that all come together. And when he's at one point one with the rocks in the
Yeah.
dry riverbed, and I think it's hard to pin down specific things that are happening. There's a general blurring of lines happening throughout sort of the poem as it goes on.
Mhm. Beautiful poet on top of human being.
Yeah, I'm a fan. He's a little less well known. There's a whole movement of sort of religious Zionist poets that start, so really the generation after him, they started a journal that's still active called Mashiv HaRuach. There's I forgot the book, but there's a American author named David C. Jacobson who wrote a book on Mashiv HaRuach and the poets associated with it. That's available in English. So anyone who's interested can look at that. We'll also, for everyone who comes to the workshops, we're going to look at some more of Rav Froman's poetry, both in the class part of the workshop and in the practical, playing with, experimenting with translating poetry section, but also look at some of his younger contemporaries like Sivan Harshefi and Rav Elchanan Nir, and anyone who was at my class last year will be familiar with some of those. But we'll see some new poems for anyone who was there last year.
Wow.
Anyone else? Anyone from one of the other platforms, Noah?
No. So,
Wonderful.
just again, like to say thank you to Rabbi Morrow and to everyone here for participating, for being part of our learning community, for being very involved. It's great when folks actually participate in this type of work. We're meant to participate, not just soak it in. We're actually breaking the bread of our learning. So as always, thank you. Feel free to register for as many classes as you're interested in joining us for, and we look forward to learning with you again soon. Please be well.
Thank you.
everyone.
Thanks so much. Thanks. Good to commune with you. Thanks, Miriam.